Okay, we finished the integumentary system. We're ready to talk about the skeletal system next. Before we start talking about specific bones and parts of bones and such, we're going to deal with a few of the concepts having to do with bone tissue. We've already talked about the histology of bone, how compact bone compares to spongy bone. There are two different kinds of processes that lead to bone formation. One of them is called, we're going to call it dermal bone, also known as membrane bone. Dermal bone or membrane bone. We just talked about the dermal scales that form in the head of fish not too long ago. So anyway, we have that dermal bone element that we're familiar with there, forming from those scales in the dermis. So this kind of bone forms in the dermal layer from the connective tissues in the dermis, just starts to lay down bone in there, and we'll talk more about that here in a minute. The other process of bone formation accounts for most of the other bones of our skeleton. Only a few bones in our skull are derived from this membrane bone formation, and possibly part of the clavicle. Let's see, the other is what we call endochondral. Sometimes referred to as cartilage bone, because the bone material replaces cartilage as it develops. So it's first cartilage and then it becomes bone. Endochondral bone formation. So these are two different processes of bone formation. I'm going to go through here and illustrate the process of endochondral bone formation in a series of drawings, and then later we'll talk about dermal bone. Okay, here we are going to begin the process of endochondral bone formation. So we're going to start with a piece of cartilage. This is all hyaline cartilage. To begin the development of our bone, on the very outside of your hyaline cartilage, I'm going to indicate this with a, let's see, use a light orange color to indicate this connective tissue that lies right on the very outside of a cartilage. Just going to make a dotted line right now for this to represent a thin layer of dense connective tissue that forms on the outside of the hyaline cartilage. And we refer to that as a perichondrium. Perichondrium. So most of your long bones, think of your humerus, for example, a radius or ulna in your arm, any of those long bones that you have, they begin first as a piece of hyaline cartilage developing in the embryo. They're laid down as hyaline cartilage and around them a perichondrium. And then they're going to eventually change over to bone. And the next step we're going to see in this bone formation is we're going to develop bone right underneath the perichondrium right here, between the perichondrium and the cartilage. So we're going to get our first bit of bone to form right here, right in the middle of the shaft of the bone. And it's going to make what we call a bony collar around this middle part of the developing bone. Okay, here we are in our next stage. We now have our bony collar developed. This brown line I have drawn on the outside of our cartilage. Actual dense bone tissue developing there. And then to the outside of that, we no longer have what's called a perichondrium, but we have what we call the periosteum. Of the bone. The membrane that forms adjacent to the bone on the outside. It's called periosteum. The next event we're going to see in the development of the long bone is an area in the middle, the very center of this developing bone, that will start to essentially die out. That cartilage starts to, the cells enlarge and eventually they die. And that's where we begin to form, well, we're going to invade it with blood vessels. And eventually spongy bone will form in that very center right there. So that's the next drawing. Okay, so here's what we described. This area in the very center of the cartilage. That cartilage starts to calcify. It becomes more solid. The cells in the cartilage start to enlarge and eventually die. And as they do so, a new blood vessel is going to come in here and a vascular supply into that center. And that's where we're going to start the formation of new spongy bone on the inside of the bone. And this area in here is referred to as the primary center of ossification. Ossification is just the formation of bones. It's the primary center of ossification. It begins here and then it spreads out from there. So we're going to get spongy bone to form in here, and then we're going to get new centers of ossification to form at the ends of the bone. Okay, now we're in our fourth picture in the development of the endochondral bone. The center area here is now mostly, the cartilage is going away, and it's forming spongy bone. We still have the bony collar around the outside, so this will eventually all become bone across through here. At the ends of the bone, we're getting new centers of ossification. This would be a secondary center of ossification. And this is also secondary up here. I'll just put that up there. We still have a periosteum on the outside, the bony collar around the outside. Still a lot of cartilage between the ossification centers, the primary and secondary ossification centers in here, and still cartilage at the very ends of the bone, at the top and the bottom, that will stay there for most of our long bones. This is going to turn to spongy bone here and spongy bone up here at the other secondary center, and those will expand. And eventually, you'll have a point where the primary and secondary centers of ossification meet, and there'll be just a narrow zone of cartilage between those two. Okay, this is our last drawing in the formation of a endochondral bone. Cartilage started the bone, and eventually we developed a collar around the outside of the cartilage. In the middle, we developed a primary ossification center where cartilage was converted over to spongy bone. That spongy bone expanded toward the ends, and we started new centers of ossification at the ends. Those secondary centers of ossification then grew outward toward the center on either end, and they meet at a plate right here between the two ossification centers, and these are called epiphyseal plates. There's one there, and there's another one up here, two epiphyseal plates. Bone continues to grow at that epiphyseal plate. This cartilage continues to grow and expand, and we add to the length of a bone at either end at the epiphyseal plate in a long bone like this. It's the way long bones grow. Other kinds of bones have a different kind of growth pattern. They don't have an epiphyseal plate. Long bones do. At the end, we still have cartilage at either end. Compact bone on the outside underneath the periosteum. Spongy bone underneath of that. In the middle, these long bones develop what we call a marrow cavity. On the inside. A little later, we'll look at the overall anatomy of a long bone as an organ by itself and identify some of these parts again. Okay, we've talked about endochondral bone formation. We mentioned that most of the bones of your body are formed by endochondral bone formation, where you start with a piece of cartilage, and that cartilage is gradually replaced with bony tissue. Now we're going to talk about membrane bone, or what we sometimes call intramembranous bone formation, or dermal bone. Intramembranous bone, membrane bone, or dermal bone formation. We start out with a layer of dense connective tissue, or just collagen material laid down here. There would be fibroblasts all through here. Some of these fibroblasts will eventually divide and become, well, some of the precursors to fibroblasts will become osteogenic cells. They're cells that will start developing bone within this membrane. So we'll get small pockets of ossification to develop within this membrane. So that's the next thing we're going to show. We start with just a membrane of collagen here, just a layer of collagen, and in that we're going to start developing some spongy bone. So here's our collagen membrane here, and within that membrane some of our cells develop into osteoblast cells that start to form bone matrix. And so we have the initiation of some spongy bone, the beginnings of spongy bone within the membrane forming through here. Eventually we have little separate plates that develop in there, and that's the next stage we'll show. So in this picture we haven't done much more to the bone except for expanded the amount of spongy bone that's present within this membrane. So we get these regions and they eventually all connect up, and we'll get a continuous layer of spongy bone all the way across through the membrane, with membrane on either side of that spongy bone in the inner core. And then finally we're going to lay down some compact bone to the outside of our spongy bone pieces that are scattered through here. So here we are at the last stage. We finally have on the very outside of our bone here, we have compact bone. We have the middle layer of spongy bone. And we have the outer layer of periosteum. This was initially just a layer of dense connective tissue like you'd find in the dermis. We call it dermal bone or membrane bone. So you have that thick membrane of collagen fibers. And within that collagen, we saw the beginning of some osteogenic activity. Some of the cells that were in there became osteoblast cells that started to lay down bone matrix for small little centers of ossification, small points of ossification that came together into larger bundles or bunches of osteogenic tissue that were fused together, forming little spongy bone plates in the membrane. And those spongy bone plates within the membrane eventually fused together to make a solid spongy bone through the membrane, and then we lay down that compact bone on the outside of that, and the connective tissue on the outside becomes the periosteum in this case. So that's membrane bone formation, or intramembranous bone, or dermal bone. And the plates of your skull, your primary frontal, parietal, occipital bones covering the roof of your skull, form in this way. A few of the other skull bones form as dermal bone as well. So there we go. Okay, now we're going to look at the anatomy of a long bone. See if we can get everything focused here. The anatomy of a long bone, we've been over this a little bit when we talked about the development of endochondral bone. The last stage was pretty much this same configuration where we have on the very outside layer right here, what's called a periosteum. Periosteal layer, then we have the compact bone. Solid layer underneath that. Then we have the spongy bone layer. And that spongy bone expands out here toward the ends of the bone to fill up all the space inside. And then we have a marrow cavity. In the center. And that's mostly fat tissue. There might be some blood-forming tissues in the marrow cavity. Most of the spongy bone, that spongy bone space, remember, is filled with blood cell forming tissues. All those little spaces within the spongy bone. At the very end of the bone down here and at the other end we have a articular cartilage. Articular cartilages, and make that joint surface smooth and not as hard as bone on bone at your joint. It's cartilage on cartilage that way. The center portion of a bone, the long shaft portion of the bone right here, is referred to as a diaphysis. The diaphysis of the bone. The very end part beyond the epiphyseal plate there is the epiphysis. The epiphysis of the bone there, and there's another one up here. Between the epiphysis and diaphysis, there's a small zone right here on either end that would be called a metaphysis. And of course, at either end, we also have that epiphyseal plate. After you're finished growing, past your growing years, we slowly replace that entire epiphyseal plate of cartilage with solid bone material. You can still see where it was and the way that the bone forms in that epiphyseal plate, but the cartilage zone is gone. Articular cartilage hopefully will stay on there so you can have good working joints for a long time. So anyway, that's the anatomy of a long bone. There's an epiphyseal plate up here as well, and articular cartilage at the top as well, that I did not label there at the top. So you'll need to know this. This is the anatomy of a long bone, the structure of the anatomy of a long bone.